The US's blanket levy of 10% on all its imports from China could well dampen the movement of Chinese goods into the world's largest economy. This could well mean that China will soon become laden with overcapacity across all these sectors, meaning that it would continue to produce all these goods, but it would be far more than what its traditional buyers may want to buy. So it could well mean that China will start cutting prices on all these goods to such a level that other markets may welcome them. Overcapacity is essentially China's problem, but Chinese overcapacity is becoming India's problem. Here's why. Hello and welcome back to Business Matters at The Hindu with me, K. Bharat Kumar. Recent media headlines have amply spelled out the headache that India's steel industry is facing. This relates to imports of lower grade steel from China at prices that cannot be matched by Indian makers without impacting revenue and profit margins. India's steel imports from China expanded about 37% for the 6 months ended September 2024. A November 2024 report from brokerage Angel One points out how this influx of steel, especially from the likes of China and South Korea, have put intense pressure on Indian local manufacturers. The note also points out that many importers have been able to make minor variations to their products, thus making it difficult to enforce strict import regulations. This trend of cheaper Chinese steel being available in India has pushed India to become a net importer of steel, a far cry from the net exporter position it held some time ago. In the middle of last year itself, JSW Steel Chief Sajid Jindal had indicated how cheaper Chinese steel is actually affecting the financials of Indian steel makers. This problem has been exacerbated by some free trade agreements that India has with some of its trading partners. So what happens is these partners import Chinese steel for their own local use and then export the steel that they make, our trading partners make, to India. It's essentially like rerouting cheap Chinese steel into our country. Obviously, steel is not the only sector where China can spoil the playing field for Indian firms. The logical way to view the impact of US tariffs on Chinese goods that could potentially impact India is to see the top common items that both US and India import from China. Then by inference, any tariff the US places on Chinese products in these sectors could theoretically result in more of these items finding their way into other markets such as India, but at far cheaper rates than earlier. It's certainly a point to note that if India does not already have local manufacturers of such items, then the end consumer would benefit because of the availability of low-priced imported goods. But if India does have a manufacturing base, then the local makers of such items, example steel that we talked about, would be impacted. This means for these companies, loss of profitability, lower capital expenditure investments, fewer jobs being created, and essentially a negative for India's economy. The image on your screens tells us which sectors see high Chinese imports in both US and in India. India imports a mere 5 items, only 5 items, but together worth at least $80 billion worth from China. And these are the very items which are also under threat from the Trump administration. So India would do well to watch out for any dumping that could happen across these sectors. These are electrical and electronic equipment, machinery, nuclear reactors and boilers, plastics, articles of iron and steel, and optical, photo, technical, and medical apparatus. But these are just sectors that are high in value. There are other sectors that are critical but may not see such a high value of imports from China. These are sectors where the path to being self-sufficient for India is already very hard. Or worse, we've actually ceded space to imports in these sectors from a point where we were self-sufficient. Pharmaceuticals is one such sector. Active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs are raw material that help make medicines. Both US and India import APIs from China, but India is far more dependent on its neighbor for APIs than America is. On average, India needs to import about 70% of the APIs it needs from China. And in certain categories of drugs, such as life-saving drugs, that percentage could be as high as 90%. A 2023 article that appeared in the Atlantic Council highlighted the warning that China could well weaponize its superiority in trade. The article says that Chinese commentators have long suggested leveraging the market share of Chinese API producers in service of Beijing's policy goals. The article cited the example of a former central bank advisor in 2019 suggesting that Beijing should leverage its exports of antibiotics as a retaliatory tool in the US-China trade war. Similarly, a March 2020 editorial in state media outlet Xinhua made a similar suggestion saying China could assume strategic control over supplies and limit exports. In a research note that it put out last September, consulting major Deloitte reviewed 3 product areas from China, just 3, in which China saw the largest gains in trade surplus that was driven by export growth. These three were lithium-ion batteries, solar panels, and automotive vehicles. China's exports of lithium-ion batteries grew fourfold between 2019 and 2023 to $69 billion. The country is a world leader now in lithium-ion batteries. India's economic survey that was released just a few days ago on Jan 31st noted that India depended on China for 75% of its lithium-ion battery requirements. As of 2022, China held 75% of the global production capacity inside its shores. Batteries are military-relevant technologies, as the Atlantic Council calls them, so one should expect a rush of trade barriers by the US on imports of these batteries from China, which means that India should be prepared for a rush of its imports that are ridiculously priced, potentially. Let's come to solar panels. There's a prevalent view that the solar energy sector in India would not have done as well as it has without cheap imports from China. Not only for India, but even countries like the US seem to have benefited with the availability of such low-priced options. This has meant an impetus to domestic GDP, creation of jobs, expansion of the sector, and so on. But even before Mr. Trump assumed office and levied this 10% blanket levy on all Chinese goods, even before that happened, India has faced the issue of dumping of these imported products by China at rates much lower than what can be matched by Indian makers. India has faced this issue, so it has had to intervene and levy an anti-dumping duty on solar glass panels from China and Vietnam. But there's always another side to the story. The aim was to protect domestic producers, but power project developers said that this would trigger higher prices, affecting project costs and challenging deadlines. Now, China's share in all stages of solar panel production globally stands at 80%. That's how dominant China is in this sector. Now, let's look at the third sector where China has been extremely successful in terms of production and ramping up exports to the rest of the world, automobile production. Historically, India has had a very good base of domestic car manufacturers, so it does not need to worry about cheap imports from China, which will flood the market and so on. But key components such as semiconductors still come from the likes of China. You may recall that during COVID-19, auto sales were heavily affected in India by a halt in chip supplies from China and other countries. Waiting periods for cars in India ran to several months for buyers. So that brings us to one popular point of view, that what is very good for end consumers need not be at the same time very good for the country as a whole. Without self-sufficiency, being vulnerable to imports from a hostile neighbor, especially in critical sectors, is always a lurking danger. That's what some industry observers tend to feel. Of course, there's no need for despondency here, because the key takeaway for India from all of this is that China has actually shown the rest of the world how easy it is to quickly ramp up production and find markets globally for its exports. Let's look at just those three areas that Deloitte has referred to. Between 2019 and 2023, a period in which China had very strict lockdowns for about 2 of those years due to the pandemic, Chinese lithium-ion annual exports zoomed from 17 billion to 69 billion. Automobile exports rose from 8.6 billion to 77 billion in the same period. Of these, electric vehicle exports were minimal in 2019 but had surged to 34 billion worth by 2023. The coming few months are going to be very interesting and will tell us how these economic superpowers are going to behave. What do you think we could expect? Collaboration? Competition? Confrontation? We'd love to hear from you. Leave your thoughts in the comment section below. That brings us to the section where we share nuggets of information with you. As always, here goes. You all probably know that India-China trade via the Silk Route dates back to at least the 2nd century BC. But did you know that the Black Death plague that wreaked havoc in Europe in the 14th century is believed to have stemmed from bacteria actually carried by travelers originating in Central Asia? That brings us to the quiz question for this week. What is Beijing's share in New Delhi's imports of industrial goods, and how has that changed over the past couple of decades? It's a trend that think tanks say are worrisome, not just for economic reasons, but also for national security. And here we have the answer to last week's question. When was uranium discovered? One person got this right in the comment section. Congrats. Uranium was discovered in 1789 by Martin Klaproth, a German chemist, and named after the planet Uranus. That's all we have for you in this episode. But do keep an eye out for geo-economic developments. A lot of interesting months, I feel, are ahead of us. And as always, we'll keep you updated. If you enjoyed watching this episode, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. Till we meet you again next week, have a lovely time ahead.